This is Dr. Weisslogel, and today I'm going to, in this presentation, talk to you about a very important paper by philosopher Virginia Held, which appeared in the journal Philosophy and Phenomenological Research back in 1990, called Feminist Transformations of Moral Theory. And we're going to take a look at some of her ideas and see how they compare to the other philosophers' positions that we've been studying. So some of the key ideas in this paper. First of all, according to Virginia Held, ethics has been constructed from a male point of view. In other words, ethics is not gender neutral. Now, that's a bold claim, and you have to ask yourself, as you were studying the various moral theories that we've discussed, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Kant, Mill, ask yourself whether you had the impression that those philosophers were trying to speak just to men, or whether you got the sense that what they were saying applied to men, whatever their intentions happened to be, or exactly what it might mean to think from a male point of view. I don't believe Held is arguing, although in some cases she might, but I don't believe she's generally arguing that the philosophers that we've been discussing intended to construct their theories from a male point of view. I don't think that was their overt intention. However, she says that these theories in fact were constructed in such a way, and that because they have been constructed in such a way, they may not be doing what these philosophers probably thought they were trying to do, which was to tell us about how it's best for us to be as human beings, regardless of which human beings we are, male or female, and so forth. So let's take a look as we go along to see what we think of this claim. Held will argue that feminist ethics will have a different starting point from this male point of view that she's detecting in these theories, and that feminist ethics will require a wholesale transformation of moral theory. In other words, she's going to say that we can't simply add on to our moral theories, the traditional moral theories, the influential moral theories that are operating in society. We can't simply add on to those. We're going to need to tear them down and start again on a better basis. Some characteristics of the traditional ethical theory that she will be critiquing. First of all, it favors reason. Now, it's generally hard to argue against this. The idea is that human beings have a capacity for reason, that we could think about what our situations are, decide what's better and worse, and if we're making errors, if we're going wrong, then we double down on our reliance on reason and try to figure out where we've gone wrong and try to do better next time. That reason is the tool or the instrument, the source of how we know what right and wrong is, and we ought to obey reason. At the same time, the tradition has seen reason as a male characteristic, a strong characteristic, and emotion, desire, as a weakness, as a female characteristic, that men are the rational ones and females are the emotional ones. It sees this traditional theory sees females as natural and males as cultural. Now, you wouldn't think there's necessarily anything wrong with natural unless you think natural means being driven by your natural desires, being weakness of your desires, and cultural being how we've kept those desires in check and channeled our desires in certain ways in order to develop society and so forth. So natural versus cultural sees males as the form of human being and females as the matter of human being. Now, we discussed these metaphysical ideas of form and matter, and a form is the what of a thing, the what kind of a thing. And the tradition is generally held that what males are like, however they thought to determine that, is what human beings are meant to be like. So males are the most human being. That's what it takes to be a human being. And if rationality is a male characteristic, then human beings are meant to be rational. And females are seen as the matter of human beings, the materiality of human beings, in a way, the baseness, the basis, but also the baseness of human beings, that which keeps us close to the animal world, the material world. Reason is meant to lift us up and out of that material world. It sees maleness then as public and femaleness as private. We can even see expressions of these kind of ideas with some traditional forms of the idea of modesty, for instance. The tradition starts with the idea of an isolated individual. Now, that's Held as saying this, but I don't think in this particular case that's exactly right. In many respects, when Held is critiquing the traditional ethics, it sounds like she's talking about from Plato to the present day. But a lot of her critique hits its target when talking about modern post-Descartes political and ethical theory. Because we saw with Descartes in the turn to modernity, this idea of an isolated individual. Remember, Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics that human beings are social, political beings by nature, not isolated individuals first. So that's really a modern idea, and then she is definitely right to see it in modern ethical theory, but not necessarily in all ethical theory. It ignores, traditional ethics does, according to Held, ignores the moral relevance of mothering, nurturing, and care, and I would challenge you to think back on the moral theories that we have been reading to see whether you could recall any discussions of mothering and what mothering tells us about human beings, or what nurturing or care tells us about how it's best for human beings to be. I would suggest you're going to search in vain. And therefore sees women as incapable of full moral personhood. What does that mean? A fully mature moral person is one who is responsible for his or her actions. Responsible. And what makes you responsible? What are the conditions of possibility of being responsible for your actions? Rationality, reason. Because if you didn't have rationality or reason, you would be not unlike, say, a shark. A shark is not morally responsible for biting a swimmer who happens to be swimming by. They're not they've actually done it, but they're not morally responsible. It's not like they should have known better to just bite a perfectly innocent person swimming by. No, we don't think sharks are moral beings, not moral persons, because we don't think they could have done otherwise. And if the tradition is trying to say that women in some ways are a function of just their desires they can't help having, so therefore they can't help acting on their desires because they're not as rational as men, it absolves them in some ways of moral responsibility. Oh, well, she couldn't help it. She was just having one of those crazy days. And Held is going to object to this idea of seeing women as less than full moral persons. So we are left with some analogies that you could see in traditional moral theory. Man is to human as woman is to natural. Man is to public as woman is to private. Man is to the polis, to the city, as woman is to the household. Man is to reason, as woman is to emotion or instinctiveness. Man is to head, as woman is to body or earthiness or heart, you might say. The aims of traditional moral theory, and I think we've seen these aims coming from the readings that we've been exploring. Objectivity, right? To be good, to be just, you have to be objective. We saw it as early as our discussion about Euthyphro, when his family and friends, no doubt, were quite shocked that he wanted to prosecute his own father. And Euthyphro says, what difference does it make whose father it is that commits such an act? We have to be completely objective about this. Don't tell me about the fact that this happens to be my own family. That context doesn't matter. We have to decontextualize our behaviors and take, in a way, a view from nowhere, a kind of utopian kind of view. Literally, the word utopia means no place. We have to take a utopian, objective, uh, universal kind of view. The aims of traditional moral theory is to get our reason right, to learn to operate and depend upon our rationality. Especially in modern moral thought, the idea is to develop, to articulate, discover, whatever the right word is, the set of rules or principles by which we could tell whether what we're doing is right or wrong, and then act in accordance with those principles, act with a good will, as Kant would say. We're looking for universality, which requires a kind of abstraction. If I want to say something that's universally true about human beings, I have to pull out, abstract from all the idiosyncratic differences that distinguish each one of us, makes us the individual singular person that we are, as Caputo would say. I have to pull out from all that just what applies in general across the board, and somehow moral theory is supposed to drive its direction, its guidance from this universality. And one of the aims of traditional moral theory is the control of our emotions. Control of our emotions. Don't let our emotions get the best of us. Don't be emotional thinkers, so to speak. Don't act with the heart. Act with your head if you want to do the right thing. And you can begin, if you are accepting of some of these observations of Virginia Held, you can begin to see a certain kind of insidiousness about this. If women are identified with their emotions, and moral theory aims to control the emotions, you can already derive a certain control of women being grounded in moral theory and political philosophy that derives from that moral theory. So there's something insidious about this, and Held is trying to put her finger on it. And one of the aims of traditional moral theory is to promote justice. Justice, we learned, is to give each one his or her due, get what's coming to them, to be a certain kind of have a certain kind of fairness in all our dealings with others. You would think that's really not bad. What's wrong with justice? Well, maybe there's more to life than simply justice. Some of the prejudices, again, of traditional moral theory that Held puts her finger on, that humans are primarily isolated individuals, that the idea of how it's best for us to be is to be autonomous, as we learned, giving ourselves the law somehow, whether it's by our rational calculation, like Mill would say, or because of the nature of rationality itself, meant to be autonomous. And one of the prejudices of traditional moral theory, which we haven't really touched on thus far, is the idea of property. That in order to be who we are, each one needs his own property in order to make oneself. And you can note that these 3 points are the key ideas of current liberal political theory. Just a word about this. In the United States in these days, we talk about the liberals versus the conservatives, but and there's reasons to talk like that. But pretty much the entire spectrum of American political life is liberal in this sense. It's liberal in the sense that it understands its citizens as, first of all, individuals, that we strive to have a certain kind of autonomy, and that private property is very important to us. So really what we have are liberal liberals, moderate liberals, and conservative liberals in this sense. In other words, hardly anybody that I know of anyway, nobody I know of is a monarchist, or even a communist. Most people don't operate in that theory, but most of the stuff you see on the TV, the debates, are over how isolated, autonomous, property-owning individuals are best served by their government. That's the question. It's not whether people are really liberal in this technical sense or not. Liberal political theory, as what we have here in the States. it treats the virtues of mothering, for instance, as supererogation. It's a good word. Supererogation means above and beyond the call of duty. And if you think about it, in John Stuart Mill, when he talks about the principle of utility is do the greatest good for the greatest number, in some ways, nothing is supererogatory. Nothing is above and beyond the call of duty. If Mill's moral theory, utilitarianism, is right, then the right thing to do requires that you keep working to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And if you haven't done the greatest good for the greatest number, keep going. Right? There's nothing that would be above and beyond the call of duty. For Caputo, and his ideas of the singularity and treating each singularity as its own unique, different, idiosyncratic, special thing and that does not fit neatly under principles or universals. In some way, everything is above and beyond the call of duty. It's almost the exact opposite of Mill. All requires more. Caputo would say it's about acting from love, not from duty. But anyway, if on moral theory something is considered supererogatory, then it's not really morally relevant. If it's above and beyond your call of duty, it means you don't have the duty to do it, and if you fail to do it, you haven't done anything morally wrong. So if mothering is supererogatory, then it would mean there's no duty to mother, and therefore, if people don't mother, you can't morally criticize them for that. And she says that's got to be problematic if you start to think about it. So here are some examples of male bias in the tradition that I have not emphasized until now. So, for instance, Plato in the Republic says, children should be taken from their parents and raised by the guardians. These are well-trained people whose purpose is to, as Plato would say, like dogs, guard the state. And children should be given to the guardians to be raised so that they form their loyalties to the polis, to the state, and not to their parents. The best state, the republic, the ideal city for Plato, would remove mothering, in the sense that you and I know it, would remove it completely and replace it with training by the guardians. Hobbes is a English political philosopher. His most important book is called The Leviathan. His political theory generally says that life prior to civilization, prior to culture, what we call the state of nature, not that there ever was that time, but it's a thought experiment. What would it be like that would require people to organize themselves in a state? What would life be like? And life in this state of nature, according to Hobbes, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, it was war of all against all. And he says what we need to do about that, if we don't want to kill each other, is we have to cede all our authority over to an absolute sovereign, and that sovereign gets to make all the decisions in exchange for keeping the peace. All right, it's the idea of a very, very strong state. Anyway, Hobbes says in this book that in the state of nature we could treat men, okay, people, but he said men, he might have meant it, as if they were not born of woman. In other words, when we're trying to do political theory, Hobbes says, you don't have to factor in the situation where human beings are born babies, born infants and vulnerable, needing to be fed and cared for and mothered. Well, you don't even have to take that into account. Now, how good is your moral theory, your political theory going to be if you don't take into account a fundamental fact about human beings? Why was that ignored? Kant says women are incapable of full moral personhood. And then he says they lose their charm if engaged in rational pursuits. That's Kant talking. All right? Women lose their charm if they engage in rational pursuits. You wonder today why there aren't so many women in mathematics, for instance, and the sciences and philosophy, for instance. Well, maybe the message was given that this is not the kind of thing that women should be interested in. Right? Back when my mother was a girl, and I'm getting to be an older guy myself, so this is a ways back. Mothers would tell their daughters, even if they sent them off to school, there was a little saying. They would say, "Men don't make passes at girls who wear glasses. Men don't make passes at girls that wear glasses." What was that advice supposed to say? It says, look, don't wear your glasses because wearing glasses makes you look intellectual. And men don't like intellectuals. Women lose their charm if women look intellectual. Men don't want women being smarter than them. That was advice given to women. Now, no wonder they don't pursue some of these um, so-called intellectual pursuits. How is that getting filtered into the general view of the relations between men and women? These ideas that are coming from these philosophers that are so influential. Um, I don't know if you ever heard that phrase before. I ask students in my classes who are all younger, and a lot of them never heard that anymore. Thank goodness that they don't hear that kind of stuff anymore. But once upon a time, not that long ago, well, that's the kind of thing that you heard. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another political thinker, said, women must be taught to submit to men and keep their sexuality in check. Keep their sexuality in check. Why? Because I guess Rousseau means that if women were to, manifest their sexuality, it would be so disturbing to men that they couldn't be these nice rational beings that they're supposed to be. Think about that. Think about what some of these important moral philosophers are conveying. Now, these aren't, in some ways, although we can debate this, the central ideas of their moral theory. Nevertheless, their moral theories are tainted, colored by these kinds of ideas, sexist, patriarchal kind of ideas, anti-feminist kind of ideas that are built into their moral theories. And I think it's important to listen to what Held has to say and take some of this to heart. We see this on this last point. We see this. These terrible stories that are coming out now about, for instance, campus rapes. Somehow it's the victim's fault. Oh, well, she was dressed provocatively, or she was at a party and had cocktails or something. Come on, right? But some of these ideas carry through and have been given some credence by society at large, and it's worth keeping these ideas that are under the hood of these moral theories in mind. Now, what would feminist transformation start to look like? Well, first, Held says, let's start with a relational self rather than an isolated individual. Let's start with the idea that we're not these little monads, these little billiard balls that just knock into each other as we roll around reality. No, that we are who we are as a function of the other human beings with whom we share this earth, starting with our moms and our dads and our siblings and our friends, and seeing that we can't be who we are unless we understand ourselves as related to others. Maybe here we come back to this idea of how to think about justice. Held says we should prefer care to justice. Justice is everybody getting their due. Care is making sure everybody's okay, that they're getting what they truly need to survive and thrive and flourish. Justice is this abstract. What's the picture of justice we have? It's justice is wearing a blindfold, holding scales, like we're just measuring out dollops of stuff. Where care is eyes wide open, arms wrapped around somebody. Not blind justice, not abstract justice. Held says we should consider particular others rather than egoism, which means you don't have to consider any others. It's all about me. Or universalism, which tries to say in some sense, like Kant would say, or even Sartre in some ways, that you have to think about all others. What if everyone were to do this? Asked Kant. What if anyone's dad were to do this? Asked Euthyphro. Right? try to consider particular others that are actually in your life and affected by the results of your decisions and your actions. So you could see a kind of mean between extremes here. Egoism, ethical egoism, says you just have to take care of number one, yourself. Universalism says somehow you have to take everybody, no matter what, no matter how far away, no matter where they're in the past, in the future, you have to take everybody into account, no matter what. Uh, there's something about Held's advice to stick with particular others as a starting point for our ethical theorizing that seems realistic, down to earth. Focus on trust, on motherhood, and nurture in our new moral theories. She says something really interesting here on nursing. All right, so we know about, we've talked about, I guess, nature versus nurture. We can see it back in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics. All right, is the good something by nature, by phusis? Is it something that just is that we need to discover? We saw that conversation even with Socrates and Euthyphro. Do we need to discover it, or is the good something that's built into us? It's the way we're raised. Is it nurture? Is it nomos? Is it our customs and traditions that turn us into good or bad people? Our upbringing. What is it? Are people good by nature, or are they good by nurture? But traditional moral theory equates nature with nurturing and sees them all as female and relegates them to the private household sphere, right? It turns these natural nurturing elements of human personality into something that should be pushed off, away, out of view, into the private sphere. And Held wants to say, like, look, nursing means, she doesn't mean health, she means nursing a baby, feeding a baby, breastfeeding a baby. Nursing is not simply a biological act any more than a business lunch is. So on page 336, let me just read it to you. Consider nursing an infant, often thought of as the epitome of a biological process with which mothering is associated and women are identified. There is no reason to think of human nursing as any more simply biological than there is to think of, say, a businessman's lunch this way. Eating is a biological process, but what and how and with whom we eat are thoroughly cultural. Whether and how long and with whom a woman nurses an infant are also human cultural matters. If men transcend the natural by conquering new territory and trading with their neighbors and making deals over lunch to do so, women can transcend the natural by choosing not to nurse their children when they could, or choosing to nurse them when their culture tells them not to, or singing songs to their infants as they nurse, or nursing in restaurants to overcome the prejudice against doing so, or thinking human thoughts as they nurse, and so forth. Human culture surrounds and characterizes the activity of nursing as it does the activities of eating or governing or writing or thinking. So, you know how we have these, we're skittish about something so basic, so fundamental, so natural as a mother feeding her child, that we want to make sure we don't look at it. We don't want to see it. We don't mind a couple of business guys sucking down some, chicken wings or something in a restaurant. We don't care about looking at that, but God forbid a mother breastfeed her baby in a restaurant or in a public place, and it's like the sky is falling. And Held is wondering, how did it get to be that way? Why is that? And her answer generally is that moral theory has been constructed in such a way that makes those sort of fundamental human relations between a mother and a child something that needs to be private, out of the way, unseen. So some warnings, though. You can't simply add on feminist, put an add-on spin, a feminist spin to traditional moral theory. Why not? Well, one of the reasons is you can't assume that female virtues are always desirable, right? Some of these so-called female virtues, like mildness. Women should be mild. Oh, what a wonderful woman! She's very mild. She's very demure. Uh, well, is that really a virtue, or is that just a really convenient way for women to be so men can do whatever they feel like doing? Right? See what I mean? A virtue is supposed to be an excellence, but excellent for who? For the woman herself? Um, uh, I can't remember exactly the bumper sticker. Maybe you've seen it out there. Like history is seldom made by polite women. Right? The history is made by women who do not have these so-called female virtues. We have to look at all kinds of ideas of virtue. I mean, I can give you another one. It's not specifically germane to feminist theory, but here's another example. Thrift. We talk about this idea. I've mentioned this example before, but we need to buy clothing we can afford. We need to buy cheap clothing and say, oh, well, look at that guy over there. He's very thrifty, right? He doesn't waste his money on all that designer stuff. He buys simple, basic kind of clothing. He's a very thrifty, frugal guy. Isn't that great? Well, the only way you could be thrifty and frugal in the way the world is designed right now is that there be sweatshops somewhere else in the world that you can't see that's producing this clothing for you in a way that you can afford it. And I know you're going to buy it, I'm going to buy it, but we need to recognize exactly our own moral responsibility, as we learn with Sartre. We are responsible for the world in that sense. So be careful about what count as female virtues. They may not actually be excellences, and Held is right to say, look, there's no single feminist ethics that's out there. There's no. It's not like women think a certain way. No. That's part of the problem. Trying to put everything into silos or simplistic kind of characterizations. There's women. They're thinking about how it is best for us to be. It's now finally, after all this time, a period in history where we're hearing women's voices much more than we ever did in the past, and it's a good thing, and it makes us think. But there's no one, single feminist ethics that all women need to get in line with. That's certainly not Held's point. I want to close by just pointing out a couple of parallels to John Caputo's work that we've also been discussing in this course. Held is critical of general abstract universal rules or principles, and she writes on page 230 about deontology, Kant's theory, and utilitarianism, Mill's theory, that they share a reliance on a highly abstract universal principle as the source of moral guidance, and both share the view that moral problems are to be solved by the application of such an abstract principle to particular cases. And we saw in Caputo that you are not a case. Right? A case is what it is as a function of an abstract principle. You, according to Caputo, are a singularity. There's never been another you. There never will be another you. Nobody is exactly in the same kind of relation you are. Nobody is exactly in the same kind of situation or context that you are. And if we want to know how it's best for you to be, generalities may not always be that helpful. In fact, they can be harmful, as Caputo argued. She is critical of impartiality, and we know that Caputo says no. The idea is to try to be partial, to think about the suffering other that cries out for you to help when you don't know exactly what to do. Be partial to that person. There's an emphasis in Held on contextuality. She writes, she questioned whether the reliance on abstract rules rather than the adoption of more context-respectful approaches, how can that possibly be adequate for dealing with moral problems? Caputo did the same thing, and you can see it right from the title of his article Against Principles, his book Against Ethics. That's exactly what he's talking about. Margaret Walker is referred to, another philosopher by Virginia Held, and she opposes what Walker calls moral understanding versus moral knowledge. And moral understanding involves attention, contextual and narrative appreciation, and communication in the event of moral deliberation. And again, to me that sounds exactly like what Caputo is trying to say when he says you have to be guided by the situation. That you have to stay loose and have your ideas revisable so that in each moment you can try to be doing what the situation itself demands of you. Also, in this essay, she writes, the adequacy of moral understanding decreases as its form approaches generality through abstraction. And that's what Caputo says too, right? The more general the rule, the less practical it is when you try to apply it in your unique singular situation. So I think in many respects, Caputo, although he doesn't say so, at least not in the materials we've read, in a way could be thought of as a feminist thinker. And so I want to say that to be a feminist, you don't have to be a woman. To be a feminist, or to have a feminist influence on your thought, is to pay attention to just the kind of things Virginia Held said the tradition has not paid attention to, has not emphasized, has actively de-emphasized in many ways. So, and who are the beneficiaries of this awareness of feminist critique and feminist transformation? Who are the beneficiaries? Not just women. Everyone, according to Held and other thinkers in this tradition, say everyone benefits. Yes, women will certainly benefit from not being pushed out of the arena, for being able to break through the glass ceiling, to get equal pay for equal work, to have motherhood recognized as a fundamental human activity and not just something that needs to be hidden off on the side somewhere. Certainly women will benefit, but all people will benefit would be the argument of John Caputo or Virginia Held. Catherine Morgan, another philosopher referenced by Held, says that feminist theorists begin ethical theorizing with embodied, gendered subjects who have particular histories, particular communities, particular allegiances, particular visions of human flourishing. And again, just sounds to me a lot like what Caputo was trying to say in Against Principles about singularity. So there's a lot of this work that's going on, not just by women thinkers, but important work is going on with women thinkers, and it's starting to filter through, and it has been for the past getting close to half a century now of really profound, sophisticated feminist thought. And I think it's worthwhile for all of us to take it into consideration when we're trying to answer the question that we began the course with: how is it best for us to be?